My name is Martin Rojas. I am a UI architect for Play On Sports. As part of my recent job, we've been working on, I've been, having to think a lot about micro front ends. There was an ask to my company to do it. So as I've been working on it in the past 6 months or so, I've kind of really tried to boil it down as I've had to explain it to other devs, to leadership, and so on and so forth. And this is kind of the thoughts that have been in there. Main thing to know, to kind of start out with. There you go. And I wanted to just kind of start out with a definition so we all have a good starting ground, Represents a business domain, independently deliverable, and owned by a single team, right? From these, one of the things that I think the only one that really kind of keys and matters is the owned by a single team. That's really what you're trying to get to. With micro front ends, what you're trying to solve, it's a very simple problem. You've gotten to a point where your application's too big and you want to throw more developers at it, right? It's not something it shouldn't be something that you start out with. When you're starting out a new project, you usually start with a monolith, and once you have built up and you're starting to hit that friction where you can't grow more, you can't throw more developers in it, micro front ends is an architectural solution for that. It's really an extension or a recreation of a lot of the things we've been trying to do with React within there of, okay, let's pull out things into design systems, into libraries, into separate NPM components, right? Those have all been sort of attempts and one-offs of trying to do essentially add more teams working on a project by doing this. Now, the kind of main difference, and micro front ends have been around in one capacity or another, the idea of them has been around for a really long time, all the way back to PHP times, right? But now, and recently, there's been a little more coalescing of thinking at it from a little bit higher perspective on what it is and what kind of rules we can set around them to see if this time we can actually live up to the hype, live up to what we want them to be, right? At some point, like I said, monoliths become too big. You need to do them. It becomes when you want to add more contributors to it. A lot of it is very similar and inspired by the same move that's happened in the back end of taking up your big monolith application, breaking it up into microservices, right? You're doing that when you want to add a new technology, when you want to add another team to start working on it and not get involved in the big quagmire that your main application is in. There's in there. And, in there, it's always kind of answering, the same problem of why can't I add more developers and make this go faster, right? Usually when we've had these discussions, this is not going forward. Of course, and now it did. This was one quote that I had used before to in there. It's you can't produce one baby in 1 month by getting 9 women pregnant, right? Right. There's a limit to how things can scale, right? You can't just throw more developers in it. The hope is with micro front ends, you can do a little bit of that. Like it always is, implementation from design is going to be a little different, and there's definitely some catches to it. From the hype, these are the benefits. This is what micro front ends is supposed to give you. It's supposed to give you scalability. You can add more things. Things are individual. You can get things out to market faster because each team is focused on one thing. Each team will be able to work on their part of the code and be able to ship independently. It takes a lot of work. With this, there's not one technology, and I think that's something I want you to keep in mind. These are ideas that you can implement all the way into monorepo, module federation, NPM packages, but it's really, if you embrace some of the principles that I'm going to talk about, you should be able to get to it. So I don't want to highlight in there, and at the end, I can definitely talk about some of the technologies that can get you into doing this, doing some of these parts in there, but it's in there. But you're going back into it, why transition, right? it is, you have to have a reason for it. You need to be methodical because you're adding a lot of work, right? Micro frontends are not gonna make the complexity of having a big team, having a big project disappear. You are taking the complexity from your developer teams and you are putting it on leadership, right? Now, leadership is the one that has to be able to make sure they assign the work correctly, they're assigning it to the right team, and they are figuring out how all the teams need to interact. So, in a way, it lets teams go faster because they're not having to figure out that in the code. But if the leadership that's wanting to do this, architecture, engineering managers, product owners, are now responsible for handling that complexity. It's not going away. You still have to solve the same problems. It's just where in the cycle you are going to solve the problems. You're moving it up the process cycle. And a final thing, if you are going to implement micro frontends, you need to be delivering. You need to have a vision of where it is that you're going to get to. And because you're more than likely going to implement this on a project that still needs to be shipping out features, in your plan, you need to account for that. You cannot be blocking a product from releasing for 6 months, right? This needs to be something that when you do, you need to be able to do a steps, and as you keep breaking things apart, you need to still be adding features or knowing that that is going to happen. Those are the parts where usually micro front implementations fail because you don't have an idea of where your boundaries are, where your separation of concerns are going to happen, where you're kind of creating those separate deployments, and UX or products will be like, oh, now I want to do this that was supposed to be in the other corner of the application. Well, you just broke everything we designed. You broke the entire engineering plan. So you need to have, and this is where I kind of go back to that discussion of the complexities are back on leadership. They need to be the ones that need to be agreed to the plan, and they need to stick to it. Because in UI versus the backend, it gets very easy to break it, right? Oh, but of course you can put that field in there. Of course you can do that. Why can't you do that? It should be so easy. With the backend, it's like, oh, I just don't have access to a database, right? In the front end, you have access to everything. It gets a lot easier to break those. So it goes back to your tech leads, your team leads or architecture to make sure they enforce those boundaries to make sure that your project can keep scaling. Going back, same thing as I've mentioned before, we're borrowing from microservices. There's 8, some people will say 5 different principles of what you need to do in microservices. From those, I think there's 3 that very clearly apply to the front end. Focus on the business domain. I'm sure most of you, raise your hands, how many of you have heard of domain-driven design? Right, okay. If you haven't, it's a software engineering principle of really breaking things into different domains, for example, ticketing, video player, video teams, that sort of thing, right? Very specific and where you can have the business logic in there. The one kind of difference that I'm putting into the micro frontends is that you need to think about it from your business, right? How's your company organized? That should be the main driving principle of how you break up your front end, is how is product designing it? How is this going to live in the future? Where are they going to be adding features going on? Rather than from a purely technical and ideological, like these are my domains and this is how I'm doing it. The business is going to be a little messier. So if you think about it like, oh, this part it has to do this type of features and this is what this team is going to be in charge of. Take an example, if you're doing a ticketing app, right? This team is going to be in charge of creating event tickets. This other team is going to be in charge of handling all the finance and reporting, right? It's more about the business principles rather, and that may include a couple of the domains that the backend may have, right? They can be a little more specific and break up into more domains. When you're getting to the front end, breaking down further, it's adding more complexity. Everything you break up, you're essentially creating another deployment, an entirely different app that all needs to integrate together. Second one, this is what really is meant to unleash it. From the high level view, from the integration point, you should not care what the business logic is for any one of the components. I don't need to know, and it needs to work in a way that I am not responsible. Only that team is responsible for all the business logic of it. But when they do their build or they do their release and it integrates, it should be good. All I need to know is that we have created a contract of how they're going to interact with the main application or to the other applications, to the other micro front ends, and that need to be respected. In the same way that a backend will have a open, an API spec, we need to kind of have that same mentality in our micro front ends, right? We need to have a clear contract of like, this is what I need to get my application going, and this is what I'm going to be sending out. And I'll talk a little bit further in that. And finally, automate as much as you can. Because otherwise, QA and your ability to know what's going on is going to go out the window, right? You're doing a big monolith if you're releasing it, and you have to run QA manually. That's one deployment. Once you start breaking it up to things, each one is an independent deployment. Even if it's still technically all one build happening, you're having suddenly 5 teams and like maybe 5 repos or 1 repo. You can only really scale if you have confidence in your automation, right? Say probably 90% confidence on if I hit the build and the test run, I am 90% confident the application is not going to crash once everything comes together. Until you have that level of level of trust on what you have, you are just adding more work on yourself, right? Otherwise, your QA team will not be able to track if you have 5 or 6 different teams, honestly, even 3, each one releasing on their own schedule, and then they can't plan. It goes back to the same thing. You're not getting any advantages because they still become the bottleneck, right? QA will still have to do the test of everything manually if you're doing that. So you need to have that automated testing that's ongoing and keeps building so that if one team is ready to release and when they build, we can be sure that they haven't broken anywhere else, anything else. Because stuff happens, right? We're still coming all together, still all running under one web page, right? There may be some conflicts, visual, functional, or anything. Now, starting point. Any of the technologies that you pick, module federation, in there needs to be an application shell. This is the layer, this is your starting point. This is what you could call a foundational team will have. And the point of that is it'll take care of getting called and knowing what all the other micro front ends are and loading them. Maybe taking care of authentication. Right? If you have authentication in there or you have some global config values, permissions, you shouldn't have to call it at every single one and have to have solved the same problem 20 times. Right? It should be the application shelf solves it and passes it down to each of the micro front ends so they know that same thing as I mentioned before, the API contract, they know that I know I'm expecting the token, my authentication token, and I'm expecting what my permissions are, and I can go from there. I don't care how they come from. Each team shouldn't care where they come from. They just know that when they load, they should have those items. And kind of goes into maybe something, error handling, if you have some error reporting, things like that. You don't need every team to be figuring out all of those things at the same time. You want to have that kind of global provider and then just know that they are going to in there. All of this is to kind of make it easier, make it consistent. Right? If you are providing those services, so you're kind of a platform suddenly for your application, right? We're moving to thinking of our entire system is the front end, and the shell is your OS for your application, right? And each one is programs that run in there. And that's really where the mind shift kind of comes in. If you have some state management, there may be some things that you share globally, but ideally, each micro front end should have their own state that they keep in there, right? It's a black box, and you're trying to minimize the interactions between one and the other. It's not always perfect, and later I'll kind of talk a little bit about how to talk about that. And same thing in libraries. Maybe there's some things that you want to use globally, you want to enforce. I want everybody to use certain packages or certain new tool, feature files or things like that. those need to come from the front end. You don't need to have your application making 10 or 20 different calls to your feature flag provider to get the flags themselves, right? Those should be provided from the shell, and you always solve that problem once. That way, it makes it simply that if they're expecting the flags to come this way, and you change provider to different company, you change it once, and you can do that data, remodeling and parsing, and send it back the same way. So there's no changes to any of your microfront applications. You're that buffer layer. And keeping going, from a high-level view, there's really two strategies for breaking it up. Your vertical split was your most common one. This is when you had you would click one page, it would load its entirely separate page, a different route, and it would load an entirely different application from the ground up, right? This is the easiest one to get going if you have been working on a SPA and you want another team to start working on it. They spin up another SPA, and maybe you share some UI libraries. That becomes the easiest one. Each team is responsible for everything, headers, footer, their own authentication, their own things, and then in this level, the application shell is only in charge of routing, of knowing which one to load. There's kind of a limit to it because you end up then having to have each team worry about handling routing, handling if you have an update to the header, if you have an update to the footer. They all need to make sure it looks synced or it starts looking broken up. I'm sure you've seen this in, most recently saw like Bank of America, right? You click on one page to another, suddenly have new look, old look, back and forth, right? They're doing this because each page is kind of handled as probably as an independent front end, or they're moving, but that's really what they're doing, right? They're having each team that works on a page take care of loading the header, loading there, and they're maybe a version behind and they haven't released, right? Those are the things that are there. It may be easier to get going and get started, but at the same time, you're keeping track of a lot of stuff, right? And you're having to make sure that if you're going to update a global variable, you need to make sure that all the applications update to the latest one, or the visually is going to start to break down. With the horizontal split, this one is where you start getting into a little bit bigger teams. There's a little bit more overhead in connecting it, and it's at the same point, it's kind of very similar to a lot of things we've been working on. That you may be familiar with, like it may be coming from an NPM package, right? You have a team working on components separately, and they come in and bring it together. There is essentially that same thing happening that is in there. You can have a team working on the carousel. You have a team working on the details. And there's being put together, whether it is by a monorepo, and each one is in a different part of the monorepo, and it all gets integrated together. That's technically a horizontal split architecture, right? And it's just where that integration happens that changes the name or changes the technology, right? If you had one of the talks earlier with web components, right? That is a very similar kind of horizontal split. You build a component that does one thing, and it may be going to a couple of different applications. You have one team, and when you import it into your main application, you are doing a micro front end in that sort of way, right? So it can be as big or small as possible when you're doing a horizontal split, and that allows a little bit more flexibility in keeping consistency across an application. Goes back to it. Now it goes back into the leadership, making sure that they are assigning products or what that integration is going to happen, make sure that stays in sync and it doesn't break, right? None of this gets rid of the talk that needs to happen. It just changes who's the one responsible for that integration talks and agreements. There you go. Now, kind of going to the next part. This is something that has been bugging me as a front-end developer and now architect. If you ever see a solution diagram, the UI, everything, it's a single icon, right? That's all there is to it. And it just bugs me because there's probably as much complexity in the front end these days as there is in the back end, and there's never been a way to think about it. So as part of this, one of the problems we're going to have is you have a lot more teams working on the front end. It's not just one, and we need to have a way to diagram it and be able to kind of talk about it and think about it from a visual way. I've kind of been thinking about that and borrowing some concepts from hexagonal architecture and diagramming. I've kind of put it in there. So this is to isolate the business logic, right? That box in the middle. I don't, from thinking about it as a system, I don't need to know what the rules are. I don't care. I just need to know that there is a module or there's a micro front end that does this. Same thing, the app shell, knowing what your layer kind of contains and has in there. And I am defining very clearly what comes in and out. When I mentioned about creating that API contract, that open API equivalent spec, this is a way that each team can say, I'm expecting these things, and this is kind of what's coming in and out of my application. From a higher level, that's all you care about. And same thing, if you're looking at other teams, this is really all you should know. You should be knowing what they're expecting, what they're sending in, and what they're sending out. Now, going in a little bit in there, the way that I broke it is you have your left and your right side. The left side is all the stuff that's going into your application, right? All your inputs, and then the outside is what's leaving your application. And from a vertical way, I kind of broke it into three, taking advantage of the hexagon, broke it into three parts. The top part, it's what's coming from above, what's coming from your shell. This is your authentication key, your login. The middle is the same thing that we do with every application, talking to your backend services, your APIs. Similar, what you're reading, what you're going to be calling to, and then from the exit, what you're going to be saving to, what you're writing to. And then at the bottom, because there are going to be some times where you're going to have to talk to another component, and you don't want to necessarily go up and down, which you could, but what you're trying to share is like the listener to this, or where I'm expecting to listen to it, is from a peer application, right? If we go back to that like carousel and product details, when you click something in the product details, I want so when I click something in the product carousel, I want the product details to change, right? So those would be your events. If we're talking like JavaScript, those would be like event emitters, right? At the same time, this, that could be handled by a global state manager, but at the same time, it's what I'm trying to do with the graph is kind of show it like who's listening and where the things should be coming from, right? From my shell, from my services, and then from other components. And to kind of show that how it would happen, how you would diagram a module coming in is, I have it here. I'm expecting an auth token. I'm expecting my roles, my roles of knowing what it is. And then the only thing I'm really sending back is any kind of logs to my New Relic service. All right, so you see here what I'm supposed to do, what services is providing them. Same thing in the middle, I'm reading all the events that need to be in there, and if I make any changes, I am saving those events. In this case, I'm not really expecting to talk to another module, so there's nothing at the bottom. So, yeah. At this point, is there kind of any questions? I know I've gone through a lot and I've been in a roll, but if there's any questions of anything that I've covered so far. Okay. In kind of going forward, there's some resources. These slides and a little bit more in there is in here, and there's a fantastic website that covers a lot of these things in more detail. Micro Frontend Dev 2 and 2.0. If you kind of keep digging into it. They'll talk a little bit more, and I can talk a little bit more some of the technologies, right? You have Zephyr Cloud, you have Module Federation, or even, Next.js, the new, with the app router, it is built to handle micro frontends from the get-go. You don't have to do anything else. It's taking care of all that for you, and they call it zones. So that's one way. It's something that's kind of more available. Really, the key to in current JavaScript frameworks, and this is where I'm putting it in there. In JavaScript frameworks, you're still really running one framework beneath it all, so you need to make sure the integration happens. You can have that integration happen at build time when you're running your CI/CD, brings everything together. There's certain advantages to that because suddenly you can have tree shaking, you can keep your optimizing, you can still have server rendering, right? That's some of the things that can happen, but it's still a micro front end. Or you can have them post-deployment, right? You can have things that will load up those events after your deployment. You can have those separate deployments that are not going to trigger 5 or 6 deployments to happen at the same time. That's where module federation comes in, right? That's really kind of the key difference. And one of the plans and how we're implementing it is we're building everything with build time composition, like the build time coming together happening. And when we have confidence in that, we'll switch over that build configuration to module federation to be able to then do the smaller deployments, but that's because we'll have that automation confidence. We'll have that part. It doesn't mean you still won't get a lot of the advantages in there, and it can be a spectrum of anywhere, right? You don't have to have everything for it to be considered a kind of micro front-end architecture, right? This is really you figure out where in the spectrum your project or your company needs to be to allow your more developers and more teams to work in parallel. And finally, if you are local here, we do have, I'm the organizer for React Atlanta Meetup, but not just for that. I host events with Vue Atlanta and Atlanta JavaScript all together. So if you follow any of us, you'll be notified about all the events kind of going in Atlanta that are related to JavaScript, Vue, modern web as well. And we have been starting with some of the other communities, including Flutter, Discord, so you can kind of get more involved. Same thing, we're announcing things, so you only really have to be in one point to know all the events that are happening locally here in Atlanta that are front-end focused. So, thank you. Yes? The what?
You said that the Next.js app directory allows like micro front-end out of the box without being much else. What did you mean by that?
Right. So they have a concept called zones, and if you are building in Next.js and pair it with a monorepo or turbo repo or that, they are essentially they're doing that build time compilation where you can have different apps and they will be able to pull one of the other ones and load them side by side. So and essentially it's coming in together, right? App Router lets you, even in the same directory, you can pull in. Next.js has the the folder-based structure router, right? There's a way for you to configure and essentially load 2 different parts of the application in one route. And that's essentially what you're doing micro frontend. So you can even do it in a single project and still have different folders and entirely different parts where teams are working on. Or you can split it up into a monorepo or a polyrepo, but there still have your application, your main container application that kind of brings everything together at build time. As far as I know, Next.js is not really supporting module federation yet because they've gone into a server-first rendering structure, so they need to have everything in that kind of build and server so they can optimize for it. But they call it, if you want to look a little bit of a company that's doing that, a few months ago, Next.js conference, in the video, PayPal has actually implemented this, and the architect from there kind of goes in there and talks about it. In there, if you've seen them in applications, a lot of the big enterprises they poo-poo on micro frontends because it's about really creating that compromise. And that's why I didn't want to go into any one technology, because the key to a micro front end is making sure you have the buy-in from product and making sure you define where your applications are going to be split up, because it's so easy to suddenly cross those boundaries and be like, oh, but I want to do this here. And you say like, well, that team's in charge of that. Well, okay, then let them start doing here, or let them export something, and suddenly you have that spaghetti back again, right? And that's really where, if you are planning to do micro front ends, it really needs to be a buy-in from product all the way down. Hence why you don't want to keep just purely from a technical architecture, domain-driven design, but you need to be thinking more about how your company's business works, right? What is the business domain? How are you going to break it up? Yeah, just that. Yeah. Anyone other questions? Yes.
I feel like you're talking about it. What are the downsides of, um, what do you need to watch out for? You know, I'm working on a repo, so thinking of managing, I guess, what was you had single page versus like ownership of pages?
Yes. The horizontal versus, vertical split.
So we're definitely much like the way that our product organization is set up. It's definitely the horizontal split where you have a page, one team owns header and footer, another team owns the majority of the page, and then there'll be other components that are embedded on the page. So I can't imagine not working in a model repo for that very easily without having to maintain like annoying dependencies of one or something. So maybe there's different patterns.
There can be some, but yes, like as you add like a poly repo, right? That's meaning you're pulling stuff from in there. You suddenly, in your mono repo, you have your packages and you have your apps, right? What that means is that your packages are now going to have to be npm deployed, so your other poly repo will have to bring them in. And it goes into it like you're not sidestepping complexity. You're just moving it to make sure that you've planned ahead for it. So you're shifting your problems up the stream. You have to think about them before you do them, or you can get in trouble. And yeah. Poly repo is just, you have an application that's multiple repos. So say for example, you've had your mono repo and a new team wants to come in and they want to build a new widget or something. If they start building it in a completely separate GitHub repo, that starts being called a poly repo, right? And if you're doing that, one of the easiest way to control for it is that team will build into an npm package, and then you can kind of manage the versioning. Or when you really get to that and have the confidence of being able to do these builds, that's where module federation really shines, right? Module federation, what it really is doing is that when you build and release to a server, it also releases a manifest file. So in your main build, it knows that, hey, I want to put this npm package. The index is at this URL. So I know to read it, and that tells me all the JavaScript files that I need to load. And then from an implementation, from a coding point of view, it kind of disappears as part of the Webpack, but now it's also in v kind of config. So it's really just a way of having like an index file that you can point your application to. Very similar, if you can think about it, like what Unpackage is doing. Sort of that, but more at the build Webpack level happening with your own repos. But you can see how that can get complicated, how that adds more complexity, because suddenly you need to have your local version of I'm pulling, if I'm doing locally, I need to update the config to have my local config, my staging config, because each of those need to be deployed to different servers back and forth, right? So it does give you and that goes back to what your business requirements are. Like if your business requirements, like I want the team in Indonesia and the West Coast, or I want the video team to be able to just, if they have a new feature on the video player, they want to release it, that's where module federation kind of comes in. But you're doing that, you're adding a lot more pieces that need to be in there. You need to be able to, at the same time, if the video team deploys it and they're in a separate repo, they need to be able to kick your CI/CD once they deploy to be able to make sure that they've caused no regression, the application doesn't crash because suddenly it's looking at some code they released. So if you're not doing that by having automation that can run, and you're confident that you're going to have to do, if they're going to do a release, then suddenly you need to have you build it, and you're going to have to have your entire QA team go through everything, do regression testing, right? Yes.
So, two questions. One, for the app shell concept, is that something that more or less needs to be like a Next.js type of environment, like JavaScript, sort of full stack, or could it be something like a static HTML, like a single page app? What are the requirements for that?
No, that's the thing. There's no real requirements for that. So Astro is a great example of an app shell, right? Astro is loading your islands. If you have each one in there, that's really a micro front-end architecture as well, right? Island architecture, that's what Astro is. If you're doing it in a single page application, you can still have that. The app shell just needs to have a router, and then that router needs to be able to pull in all the other packages. So it's not really no more complex. So this is really a configuration build of knowing that main application, your app shell package, of knowing where it's pulling all the code, either at build time or once it's deployed from live, of knowing where to pull the code from all the other URLs that each one has been deployed to. So in this way, you're thinking, like, for example, React Router can do this. For my project, we decided to go with the TAN router, mostly because it enforces TypeScript from the routes down, and it actually is built to be able to have sub-routers, right? So what we do is it essentially at build time, or when it's in there, because it registers to the main router and the route gets created kind of a build time, it works really well for that. So each micro front end has their sub-router. They clear up, so when you're working independent, when you're working on your own, you're working within your like sub part of the router, your parts of it, and then when it kind of comes together, because they all report up to the main router, that entire thing gets built, and you have TypeScript consistency across everything. So that's why I personally picked it up for that. But as you can see, there's many different options, and it's really how you build and how you think about how you're building it and putting it together that really it becomes in there. There's no one technology that says you have to do it this way. It's really more about building configurations, your packaging configurations, or your running configurations, right? It goes in there like all these could be web components. They could be iframes, right? You can just have iframes and each one load from a different S3 bucket or a different server. That is still just as valid of a micro front-end strategy. Each one, you have some things you give up, right? Like everything.
So I asked because the way that our sort of website, which is, it kind of follows a vertical split.
Mm-hmm.
My team works on a set of pages. I'm part of the domain. Another team works on a few other pages. And that kind of maybe leads into my next question. So it's built around like a CMS, an Adobe-based CMS. So the sort of second part, so that's like essentially a server rendered, JSP based, with a Java backend. And so the second question is, we're thinking about implementing a design system which would sort of create a hybrid approach almost, where there's like a horizontally split pieces in a vertical micro front end kind of structure. And I don't know if that.
Yes, and this is one of the things where it's as you're thinking about it, a horizontal split can be an entire page. What really makes it horizontal is that there are certain elements in the same page that different teams are responsible for, right? So even if it's just a header and everything below the header is handled by one team, but the header is handled by a second team, that could be a horizontal. What makes it kind of better to think at is that if you start building with like a horizontal mindset, you can keep breaking things down, right? As it evolves, you can keep breaking things down. With a vertical, it's easier to get going because, like you said, like each team does that, but you've got it to a point where like now we need to tie the design together. Sure, you can do that with like NPM, like releasing common CSS libraries, but then it starts tying, there's only so far you can go with a vertical, like complete vertical split mindset. But if you shift to like a horizontal, your problem is now going to be like, okay, now we need to have an integration team. We need to have one team that's responsible for integrating all the parts together. But at the same time, that'll clear it up into, okay, now we can keep breaking down the page as much as we can. We can start with a whole page and, a page that has multiple pages beneath it. But because we're starting thinking about it this way and organizing our work that way, we can keep breaking down as much as possible. Right? But the same thing is like now your lead or your products are going to have to start thinking about like, okay, if I break this off to another team, either the integration team is going to have to be responsible for making sure it integrates correctly, or when they're assigning work, making sure that they're accepting to those boundaries, right? They know like this work goes to this team and they work in this part of the page. I can't ask them to work somewhere else. Now they can have, because one of the things where it's interesting, it's like if you have a dashboard, right? If you're talking in there in a dashboard, from that point of view, breaks in things from all over the application. What that can be is that, for example, the product details team creates, exports just a package and, a component, an NPM component that's meant to be used. They're essentially making a micro front end that is just like one div and has all that logic in there. And same thing, in dashboard, the integration team just brings all those little pieces together. And that is where that bottom layer in the architecture really kind of comes in handy in something like that. Because if I have my, my filter my filter dashboard, if you're thinking of a dashboard, my filtering, that sends an event that a whole bunch of different components are going to be listening for to change their state based on that, right? And that can be through, like I mentioned before, that can be through a state management library, or honestly, that can be as simple as using, in JavaScript, we can create custom events. So here you can say like, from here, I'm emitting these events, and if you care about them, you just register, JavaScript in your events. So there's a lot of different technical ways to do it. What you have to think about is kind of the function. From a function, and then have agreement from the top down of certain things like, we're going to do them this way, and this is what we're listening. And when you have multiple ones, if you have one of these for each of your micro frontends, it becomes very easily to do a review or to know like if something is happening, okay, am I actually listening to this? Am I not? And an easy way to document. That's really what I was trying to get to this. Have an easy way to document when your team grows to like 10, 20 teams, right? Be able to kind of spot check and make sure that there's not something missing. No. Yes.
Do you have any real-world examples that you've done that have made you happy, like switching or implementing that way the first time?
I'm actually kind of going through right now. So this talk has been iterating over because of the work that I've been doing. I'm getting into the process. We've worked out the app shell. We've gone with Turbo Repo and Connect.Tech query for doing the management. In the particular, we're an SPA, so we're a single page all client application. Connect.Tech will let us kind of break up into that. Of course, as always happens in business, before we're getting ready by the end of quarter to start implementing our plan, we had two teams that wanted to start building things in together. To kind of give you an example, one of them is a team that works in Vue, completely different, right? And eventually their same application is going to live in the main application, is going to live in another one that's a Nuxt application. So what ended up being the solution for that is that this particular made sense for them, their output, to be a custom web element in Vue, because Vue supports creating custom web elements. And they're going to release it as an NPM package. In my main admin application, we are just bringing in the NPM package and custom web elements because it's not expecting a lot of input or a lot of interaction with everything else, and doing that in the mono repo, right? So even before we really have the shell quite ready, we can still kind of work from that. And when we have the app shell, it'll just clean up that router, right? It should be very easily to be able to kind of do that. So it has to be a process, and when you're building this, you need to be able to make sure that as you're adding steps, you know that the business is going to put requirements in there that are going to break your plan. So you need to have thought of ways to make sure that you can keep releasing features as you're slowly moving and breaking up pieces of the code, right? So, yeah.
If you had to migrate to server-side rendering, would you be able to use the same architecture?
Yes. Yes. Well, yes, it would work. Yes, it would work just as well. We wouldn't be able to do module federation because it has to be all done at build time if you're doing server, because the server is the one that's suddenly running it. With server rendering, it's really a problem of fetching because you don't have any state if you're doing server-side rendering. So that brings in certain problems, but not necessarily anything with micro frontends, right? Because you're still if you were doing it all in one project or multiple projects, it's still the same considerations you have to do. It might add a couple like checks and maybe some bugs that you may have to work in. It may be a little hard to trace down, but from an overall thing, there wouldn't really be any difference that I can see. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you. I think we have 5 p.m. the PowerPoint karaoke, so please get you back to your break.